Thank you. I'm Kenzie Woodbridge, and I am excited to be talking to you today about three of my favorite things. People, obscure academic theory, and technical documentation. Now, I'm not necessarily promising to change your life or your career with this talk, but perhaps I can offer up the idea that there are many ways to look at a situation, and changing the way you look at it can reveal strategies and solutions that you wouldn't have considered before. I recently completed my master's degree, and one of the great things in academia is the encouragement to take a theory developed in one context and apply it to another, often unrelated context, to see if it fits or offers new insights. So that's what I'm going to do for you here. So here's my plan. First, I'll give you a little real-life context for my work situation so you can understand where I'm coming from, since that informs my interpretations. Then I'll offer up a few caricatures of some of the folks you might find in any technical environment. I'll introduce you to player-type theory and talk just a little bit about the history of online games. Then I'll try and connect it back to those folks. Yes, sorry. I introduce you to and to documentation, and I'll finish up by identifying some of the challenges and offering some possible solutions and strategies that this application of the theory suggests. Also, I hope to make you laugh if I can, because that's part of how I measure my value as a human being, but no pressure. Okay. So, my context, and I'll try and keep it fairly brief here. I work in the IT department, specifically web services, at the British Columbia Institute of Technology in Burnaby. Woo! I hear there's some students here today. Excellent. In my job, I wear many hats. I coordinate the support for our distributed web publishing community. I do a lot of internally focused technical training. I'm a community manager on our social intranet, but my favorite part of my job, represented here by this top hat paired with a sassy monocle, is administering BCIT's knowledge base. Where possible, I think we should always do our best to publicly acknowledge our biases, so here's one of mine. I think documentation is great. I love having things written down, and I have long been a natural documenter of things in any job in which I found myself. If you're not familiar with BCIT, it's BC's second largest post-secondary. We teach specialty nursing, to financial management, to aviation, to programming, to carpentry, and on and on and on. There are a lot of complexities and a lot of different people with a lot of different devices trying to access a lot of different services, softwares, processes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This means that our documentation needs are also incredibly varied and complex. So what you're looking at here is a word cloud that I created just from the titles of our public knowledge base documents. As you can see, it runs the gamut because our KB is there to support everyone, IT folks, faculty, staff, students. I'm not going to pretend to you even for a moment that our documentation is perfect or cohesive. It's incomplete and more scattered than I would like, but I have managed to convince folks to fill a few of the gaps using some of the strategies I'll suggest a little bit later. So, documentation exists because it is created by people. So I'm going to start by sketching out a few personas in our little drama here that I think you'll know fairly well. Just a word of explanation about naming. When I was writing this talk, I realized I didn't want to accidentally tie any negative characteristics to any particular ethnic group or gender, so I decided to name my personae for cruciferous vegetables. And of course, I'm going to use the singular they as a pronoun because I'm a big believer in the singular they. So let's begin. Brussels sprout, or Sprout for short, is an experienced support desk person. Sprouts love their jobs because they enjoy helping people solve problems. They have a very good understanding of end users, including what users want to do and how well they can do it. Sprouts have significant general technical skill, but they're often person-helping specialists rather than technical specialists. I'm guessing that all of you know at least one Sprout, and I'm also guessing that some of you are Sprouts, which is actually interesting. Anyone care to self-identify? Any Sprouts in the room? Fine, no, okay. All right. Turnip. Here we go. Turnip could be any number of different technical specialists, but for our purposes, let's say that Turnip is a server administrator, probably Linux. Turnip loves knowledge, but Turnip does not like interacting with users. To Turnip, users exist to justify the existence and maintenance of servers. And my friend, those servers, they are beautiful, even if we're not all equipped to appreciate that beauty. Turnips can sometimes find themselves being a bit openly dismissive of people who can't understand what a server configuration means just by looking at it. If you're not going to spend the hours that Turnip has spent learning everything there is to know about this, you don't really deserve to have the information handed to you on a plate. Sound familiar? Maybe even a little too familiar? I'm guessing a bunch of you turnips are actually here in the room. Anyone care to self-identify? No? All right, fine. Just to be clear, I love all the turnips I know, but. All right, kale. Kale's very popular these days. Somehow, if there are 15 projects on the go, kale is always going to be right at the head of the most exciting and buzzwordy project. I know. Let's say it's 2008. Kale is leading the responsive website redesign project. Kale was definitely involved in that big cloud storage project. Kale is knowledgeable enough to get her done, but that's not what motivates them. Kale likes to win at IT. In service of that, they know how and when to schmooze, and they show up at meetings when important people are there. At the end of the project, their name is at the top of the incomplete list of deserving team members when the kudos get handed out in public. If Kale's on a project, that project must come in on time and on budget. Any Kales in the room? I suggest owning it. All right, broccoli. It's time to talk about broccoli, no matter how awkward it is. Being a broccoli, I suggest, is more of a lifestyle than a technical role. Broccoli can actually have any number of roles in your organization, although usually there are roles with at least a little bit of power. They could be a developer, project manager, server, or database administrator, support desk coordinator, etc. It's actually often hard to pin down exactly how technically skilled broccoli is, or what their availability is, or what they're actually responsible for. They're often eager to get involved in projects, but then at some point, when it can cause the most stress and anxiety to others, they become a weird, unaccountable bottleneck. Broccoli is great at engineering a situation so that they're causing the problem, but you're the one who will be blamed. I certainly hope that you don't have a broccoli in your workplace, but I'm guessing that most of us have encountered such a person in our careers at least once. Any self-identified broccolis in the room? Oh, there's one person. There we go. Now, some of you might be sitting there saying, hold on, you led us down a garden path. With your talk description. This is all vegetables and stereotypes. I'm here to see someone apply an outdated ludic research framework to documentation strategy. Well, don't worry, we are going to do that. So put your hand up if you know what a MUD is and have ever played one. Oh, quite a few of you, yes. For those of you who haven't, MUD stands for Multi-User Dungeon. They are text-only online multiplayer games. Richard Bartle and Roy Trubshaw created one of the very first MUDs in 1978, which happens to be the year I was born. Their popularity likely peaked in the mid to late 90s, which is when I spent my time playing and creating in them, but there are still hundreds online and playable today. The MUD you see me inexpertly navigating above is actually a version of Bartle and Trubshaw's original MUD called MUD 2, still online and playable. I recorded this just a couple of months ago. All right. So what is player type theory? In 1996, Richard Bartle published an article in which he described 4 types of players differentiated by their motivations. The easiest way to explain the types is to sketch out a simple combinatory table. We only need 2 axes. One axis I'll mark as interact at one end and act at the other. I find it helps to think of them as interact with and act on. The other axis has players at one end and world at the other. Then each of the 4 quadrants is a combination of 2 traits. So up at the top left, we have the combination of interact and players. These are the folks whom Bartle called socializers. They have fun by interacting, usually pleasantly, with other players in the game. Then over here, we have interact and world. These are explorers. They have fun by gaining in-depth knowledge of the game, its mechanics, and the environment. Though they might have the hard-won skill to beat the game, that's not really interesting to them. They like to find hidden things or understand the game mechanics. Down here, we have act and world. Bartle named these players achievers, and they have the quest, they have the fun by acting on the game world and beating the game. They do all the quests, they get the highest level, get the best armor, all that sort of thing. And then in the final quadrant, we have act and people, and Bartle, not one for mincing words, called these players killers. They have fun by acting on other players, often by disrupting their play, perhaps by killing them or destroying what they've built or collected. So these four are Bartle's player types, and in his player type theory, Bartle posited both a number of interactions and dynamics that you would expect to see between players, and he also suggests ways to design a virtual world to encourage or discourage various types in hopes of finding a stable equilibrium of players in a game. So caveat time. Before I go on, in case any of you were starting to get itchy at the idea that there are somehow 4 types of people in the world, I would just want to reassure you, this is obviously a simplistic model, and our identities and motivations are inherently unstable. Bartle himself suggests that players may have different motivations in different contexts or may progress through all 4 of them over time. I'm just an academic communications nerd who thinks this kind of exercise is interesting. Fun, actually, so invite me to all of your parties. Anyway, caveat time over. Now, I was reading Bartle's article about player types, and I noticed something. Although Bartle was writing about playing a game, he sure mentioned documentation a whole lot. And that's especially true when he talks about the difference between the top half and bottom half of our combinatory here, the interact with versus act on. Bartle talks a lot about the difference between a game which you're designing specifically to satisfy explorers versus one that you're designing to satisfy achievers. So here's an example. Emphasizing interacting over acting means designing for explorers, and Bartle says to make the help facilities produce vague information and produce cryptic hints when players appear stuck. And here's another example. Emphasizing acting over interacting means designing for achievers, and Bartle suggests providing a game manual and including automap or autolog facilities. When I read this, it immediately struck me that this might offer a useful insight into a phenomenon that I frequently saw in my workplace. Perhaps you've seen this too. Not all of the time, but at least some of the time, some of the most specialized and expert people are also the people who write the least documentation. This has always puzzled me. But if those deep dive specialists are motivated in their work by discovery, by figuring things out, then having proper documentation would actually take all the fun and enjoyment out of that. They can work and even thrive in an environment with poor or no documentation because it's engaging and interesting. So this made me start thinking about applying the model to my work environment. So let's go back to our combinatory again. I'm going to modify it just slightly for the workplace application. I'm going to leave interact and act just as they are, but I'm going to swap out players for users because I want to limit the scope of this a bit. And then I'm going to swap out world for technology, since that's what we're interacting with. Now, let's bring back those personas I talked about just a few minutes ago. You've probably already guessed from what I just said that I'm proposing that Turnip is an explorer because they like to interact with the technology. Sprout, who enjoys interacting with users, is a socializer. Kale, then, with their love of ending up on the top of the heap, is an achiever. And yep, that makes Broccoli, the gatekeeper and weird subtle power player of the group, a killer. So, what does this schema mean for technical documentation? Here's where I'm going to tell you another of my biases. I don't think documentation is something that only a technical writer should do. In fact, in a complex organization like the one I work for, no. Well, exactly. Yeah. But then I need my notes. Hey, all right. Okay. In a big organization like the one I work for, and in small ones which don't have enough, money to actually hire a specialized writer, it simply can't be limited to a specialist. We all can and should document at least some of the things we know because it makes our own work and the work of our colleagues and clients easier and more efficient. So, let's get to the meat of this talk. Let's take a tour back through our cruciferous characters, and we'll talk about how each of the types is likely to approach documentation and what challenges that might create. And then I'll highlight some strategies suggested by player type theory that have worked for me. Sprout first. I'm going to suggest to you that since Sprout's focus is on users and meeting user needs, the Sprouts of the world actually often love documentation because it helps them to solve a user's problem quickly and without missteps. They can send a user to a resource that lets them do self-help, or they can step through it with them in person or on the phone. Documentation also helps Sprout to maintain their broad technical experience and knowledge, and they tend to give back to it. As a support desk worker in a team, Sprout also often wants to support their colleagues, so if they figure out a workaround that isn't documented, they will document it. In fact, in my experience, Sprout is a natural documenter. And if Sprout is working in a place without a central documentation repository, or if they are prevented from easily contributing to it, they will be the person with 40 Word documents on their desktop that they can quickly email to somebody. Sprouts are important and even pivotal contributors. Now, they can be incredible documentation allies, but because of their connection to users and the perception that they are less technically skilled, which may well not be true, they're often not given much respect from other types. I suggest a two-front approach, personal support and public support. So under personal support, first, and this actually applies to every type to a greater or lesser degree, I suggest that you can never go wrong with a structured template. Nothing aggressively and intimidatingly stares down a potential documenter like a completely blank document. Second, and this also could apply to each type, I suggest that some non-judgmental assistance with editing and publishing could be useful. If you're lucky enough to have a specialist writer or KB administrator like me on the team, then that kind of support is just natural for that role. If not, a buddy system could be a good strategy, or social group documentation sprints with a culture of folks being a second reader for each other. You also need to support Sprouts in public and include them where they're being needlessly excluded. Become the local Sprout ambassador. Don't let anyone speak ill or be dismissive of them in your presence. Talk about the good work they do, the docs they write, their expertise and knowledge of users, their user empathy, etc. Thank them for the work they do publicly in front of others, and include them. If you're in project meetings and there's never anyone there who supports users in using the thing you're building, ask why not. Ask it often. Get those people in the room because they know things that developers and administrators and project managers don't know. Basically, what I'm saying is, if you care about documentation, Sprouts are your natural allies, and if they're being dismissed, forgotten, excluded, or discounted, your documentation is going to be worse, your workplace culture is going to be less engaging and enjoyable, and supporting your user community is going to be an awful lot harder. Turnip. As an explorer, Turnip is motivated by knowledge and likes to have the freedom to explore. Learning and exploring are so central to a Turnip's motivation that they can take precedence over achieving a project goal on a specific timeline. This can cause conflict. For example, something that I hear a lot from the Turnips in my department, whom, to be clear, I love, is that they don't want to tell users best practices or guidelines for how to use a tool because the tool is flexible and users should want to spend a bit of time exploring it and figuring out how they want to use it. Sound familiar to anyone here? Most of the users I support want a clearly delineated process and best practices laid out for them to follow because their technology use is not a game and it is not for fun. It's in service to a different goal or purpose, and their time to engage with it is limited. Combine this with the fact that what Turnips have and what they respect is deep technical knowledge, and you can see how this introduces tension into a workplace where there can actually be a significant difference in technical skill level between different people. Turnips tend to be, sad to say, a little quick to judge others against their own experience and expectations. This means that for Turnips, folks who aren't interested in exploring the technology for themselves aren't busy people with a lot of work to get through in a day. Instead, they're simply wildly inferior Turnips. Turnips, I suggest, are natural anti-documenters. If a Turnip does document something, I would suggest that it is likely to be reminiscent of the quote I already showed you, cryptic hints that only another similarly skilled Turnip could parse. And of course, when this documentation doesn't appear to stop people asking them inconvenient and annoying questions, they tend to give up pretty easily on the whole concept. So here's my advice. If your goal is documentation that is correct and detailed, then the folklore contained in a Turnip's brain is your holy grail. Because they're not naturally inclined to document things, and they're busy doing important work, you may need to alter your process to accommodate them, but it's generally worth doing. To get those docs out of them, first you need to reframe documentation for them. Get them to think about documentation as maybe showing off their expertise to others, proving that they are in fact knowledgeable. Then remind them that good documentation can be used to reduce interruptions in their life from users. This also means that culturally you need to back them up and maybe sending users to the docs first and insisting that they try to read them before asking for further help. And third, you could reframe documentation as yet another thing for Turnip to be knowledgeable and expert in, right? So then you need to support their writing efforts. First, you'll need to reduce the barriers that stand in the way, provide templates, help with publishing, do whatever you need to do to get their knowledge out of their head and on the page because it is worth it. This means that at least some of the time you may also need to edit and rewrite some of their documentation for users. We all get to choose the hills we are willing to die on, but I'd suggest that winning the fight on consistent use of the Oxford comma with a turnip is not a good use of your time. especially if it prevents them from getting what they know out in an accessible form. So, CALE. How does CALE relate to documentation? It really depends on how it fits into what they're trying to achieve. Because remember, achieving great things is what CALEs love best. This means that if documentation is part of the criteria that will be used to evaluate the success of a project, it will be a priority for them. Otherwise, it won't. As a documenter, I would suggest that CALEs are often opportunists. They'll happily reuse or repurpose existing docs. This can be positive or negative, depending on the quality of that existing documentation. CALE is into big bang launches because that's where the accolades are, but not so much into incremental improvement or long-term maintenance or support. As documenters, CALEs are inconsistent, is what I'm saying. So unless producing documentation is enforced as mandatory for the success of a project, it will fall off their radar. In my experience, they can be great, but you have to catch them at just the right moment. So first, I suggest that you want to literally gamify documentation for them. One way to do this is literally post the stats on who's doing the doc writing. Who wrote the most or most visited this week, this month, this year? Who has the greatest proportion of current reviewed docs, and so on. CALE likes to have their name in lights, so maybe consider making the author of docs visible in some fashion, although I admit this might not be desirable in all circumstances. Of course, the biggest gamification strategy I suggest is to not let writing documentation be an optional side quest. Having user support docs in place before launch needs to be a critical success criteria. That's probably a whole other half-hour talk contained in that one bullet I acknowledged to you. Once you have them concerned with documentation, you need to support their achievement. One piece of advice I'd offer is to be available on short notice. Where I work, I know that about a week before the launch date of a major project, CALE is going to come to me and ask me to publish and edit their 15 docs. They're lengthy and need to be chunked and so forth. I could quite reasonably tell them to organize their work better and that their poor planning is not my crisis, but the reality is that won't change anything. And if what I want is documentation, this is documentation, and accommodating them now gets me their gratitude and further commitment to documentation in the future. Once again, templates are great. Public kudos are important. Thank them in front of others, especially in front of the folks whose judgments matter to their careers or other projects. Back to broccoli. I'm going to suggest that in addition to their other difficult traits, broccolis are often predictably terrible at documentation. Not because of lack of ability, but because information is power, so controlling information is also power. If they're in charge of the weird legacy software, it's going to be pretty badly documented. But if they haven't managed to consolidate sole ownership of a thing, they may occasionally document something when doing so lets them show somebody else up or make somebody else look bad. I promise you, however, that they will never review or update anything. Broccolis are inconsistent documenters and elements of destructive chaos. They are not, to put too fine a point on it, bullies. There we go. I sincerely hope you're not having to deal with them, but if you are, and there's no way to get these people off your project, then player type theory does suggest a few strategies. First, you want to protect yourself. Not just because these strategies can help with actually getting documentation done, they potentially can, but because, and I'm not joking now, work matters, your experience of it matters, and you are worth protecting. Only talk to these folks in public. Don't let them collar you in a quiet hallway and make commitments for which there are no witnesses. Document everything. If you do have a verbal conversation about a project, follow up with an email in which you reiterate what everyone committed to. And Bartle suggests also that explorers are the natural enemy of killers, so get a turnip involved. They know enough to keep broccolis in line and to pierce through their lies. Then you need to go forward with documentation projects as though it was completely reasonable to do so. Too often, workplace bullies are permitted to act with impunity, but if you're able to confront their behavior, do it safely. So it's dangerous out there because of broccolis. So since swords aren't really work appropriate, don't go alone. Have allies who also know what's going on with this person. Then, even though everything isn't normal, you should still act in public as though it was. What I mean by that is treat the commitments they make as though they were real and be surprised in public if they don't fulfill them. Sorry. Apologies. Follow up in writing and in public on commitments they have made and expect accountability, escalate when necessary. Privately expect delays and power plays, but don't tolerate them. All right, so that's my talk. Here's the too long didn't read. Applying academic theory to your work can offer interesting insights and also be fun. Crucifers are tasty. But more importantly, support and advocate for sprouts. They're great, naturally are on side with documentation. Reframe documentation for turnips. They then support their writing of it. It's worth doing. Gamify documentation for kales and no pressure. Successfully advocate for documentation as critical success criteria. And finally, protect yourself from broccolis and don't normalize their bad behavior. Thank you so much. Yeah. So we have 5 minutes for questions, but just so you know also, I made cruciferous people stickers, so you can come and talk to me and get some of those if you want. All right, so.
As an explorer, perhaps what you could do to help me write documentation would be tell me where other people are coming from. It's not that I don't want to help with their problem. It's that I went through it a long time ago and forgot what the opening world with the low-level monsters was.
Right. To repeat, you're saying that as an explorer, what would help you is to be told what users need to know and where they're coming from, because you went through it so long ago that you've forgotten it long ago. You've just sort of integrated all of that knowledge. I'm paraphrasing now, but yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And that's actually, to go back to the buddy system idea, I think that's where pairing up a turnip and a sprout would be great, because then you have both those perspectives. Yeah. Anyone else? What do you do when the person who owns the documentation is broccoli? All of those things, yeah. You need to just do all those things and try and make it really obvious what's going on, and then not accept it and normalize it. So often, people are so afraid of conflict that they don't ever want to confront it, and then it becomes this broken stair, right? That's the analogy that some people use. There's a broken stair, everyone jumps over it. We can't be jumping over the broken stair. We have to be going, oh my God, it's still not fixed. Like, it's still broken every single time. This is a health hazard. This is, just call it out continually. It's not always comfortable to do that, but I think that's what we need to do. Yeah. Yep. All right. First of all, you said my talk was great. Thank you. No, and then you said a member of your team said that documentation was a liability, especially best practices. And do I have a counter for that? That's ridiculous, but that's not a good counter. I don't understand how it could be a liability. Could you expand on that, maybe? Right. Yeah, well, that's why review is important, regular review of your thing. I think there's a real problem that we all have with make the thing perfect, and then it just exists now in this perfect state. And everything has to be iterative, especially in technology, right? So you say, well, we think this is probably the best practice. We're going to put it out there and see what it looks like in the world. And then we can change it. It's like probably just a web document somewhere, right? It's a website. We can change those really easily. So we're not wedded to this, but people do want best practices, and if we give them something to work with, we can change it and improve it over time. That would be my counter, I guess. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. Do people switch their role from kale to broccoli or what have you over time? I think, yeah, I think that actually tends to happen. Bartle posited an actual structure of how these things work in MUDs, and there's probably a logical progression. I wonder sometimes if broccolis are not people who have been just wildly over-frustrated in their time, right? And can you bring them back? I don't know. But yeah, I think it's really common probably for people to switch over time. And I've worked at BCIT for 18 years, so I have seen people where, I haven't worked with them directly, but people for several years report how great they are, and then they stop, and then at a certain point they start complaining about them, and you go, something happened, and I don't know what it was, but, so I think it is really common to shift over time. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes. These slides will be available online. Mm-hmm. Yes, broccoli. So you're saying, and this is the last question because I'm sorry my time is up. I'll be brief. That when you play a game, you can do that sort of solitarily, but in a team, we're often working with other people all the time. And yes, you would want to pair people up with different things. And as I said, turnips and sprouts are a great allyship, but basically any of those three that are not evil and out to get you are, that's not fair, I shouldn't say that, but sorry, self-identified broccoli, you're not evil. I don't believe that. Anyway, yeah, so you're right. Sorry, I'm out of time, so.